Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark. The Strangest Stories, Volume 10, Story Number 1. In 1970, I was serving as a corporal in the U.S. Army, deployed to South Vietnam in a region about 30 miles south of the DMZ. At the time I was second in command of a squad of soldiers. We had set up a camp in a jungle area that had a few steep hills. That evening my section was ordered to patrol one of the small valleys west of the encampment. We moved out, led by our sergeant. Not long after entering one of the small valleys, we detected movement ahead of us. It seemed to be scattered activity, so we doubted it was VC, but we weren't positive. We hunkered down for about 15 minutes, getting occasional glimpses of something moving within the trees and brush. There wasn't enough light to detect what we were observing, even though the moonlight was bright that night. After a while, the activity halted, so we continued to move slowly through the valley. As we approached a sheer wall on the hill, it looked like someone or something had stacked large stones and boulders in the pass in front of us. There was also an opening in the hill that looked like a cave entrance, approximately 5 feet high and 3 feet wide, narrowing at the top. When observing the passageway, it appeared to have been cut away by machinery. The edges were smooth with small, even-spaced grooves. We were puzzled by this because we had never seen enemy caves like this, just underground tunnels. The sergeant suggested that it may be a VC supply depot, so we started to assess how we were going to investigate the cave. About this time, things got very strange. We began to notice a putrid odor emanating from the cave entrance. The only thing I compared to was rotting eggs and human decay. It was so revolting that a few of the soldiers were becoming ill and started to back away into the jungle, including the sergeant. I was directing a light into the entrance in order to observe anything, but there was a haze that was impossible to see through. We had no idea what was before us. The entire squad took a position in the heavy brush approximately 150 feet from the entrance, far enough not to be detected, but close enough to observe the cave entrance. We quietly remained there for what seemed like forever. The jungle was strangely calm, though we heard rumbling sounds coming from the distance. It was really eerie. The sergeant was sitting near me, talking to himself. It was obvious that he was frightened. I was looking at the rest of the squad. Each had wide eyes and scanning the area. No one was going to doze off during this patrol. After several hours, dawn was approaching and it started to lighten up. I checked my watch. It was just before 0500 hours. Just then we noticed the movement in front of the cave. A being, at first I thought it was a man, moved through the entrance into the clearing in front of the cave. As it stood up from a crouch, it stood at least 7 feet high and started to look in our direction. At that time, another similar-looking creature was moving out of the cave. They were making hellish hissing sounds and looking directly at us. The only way I can describe these beings is that they looked like upright lizards. The scaly, shiny skin was very dark, almost black. Snake-like faces with forward-set eyes that were very large. They had arms and legs like a human, but with scaly skin. I didn't notice a tail, though they wore long, one-piece dark green robes, along with a dark cap-like covering on their heads. I never noticed they had anything on their feet. No one gave the order. It seemed like the entire squad opened fire at once. Every piece of vegetation between us and them was quickly sheared away. I yelled out a ceasefire order. At the same time I was looking in the direction of the cave. There was nothing there. We immediately checked our flank in case these things circled around us, but there was nothing. As we approached the cave, ready to resume action, if needed, it became apparent that the beings had escaped, most likely back into the cave. It was soon decided to set charges and close the cave entrance. When we returned to camp, we all seemed to be in a daze. There was little discussion of the incident, and we were never debriefed. So I know the sergeant never filed a report. And again, if he did, it was kept quiet by the brass. Next story. About 10 or 12 years ago, I remember going fishing with a friend around my family's property in rural South Dakota. I was 14 or 15 at the time and had my learner's permit, so I took our small farm truck down to our creek with my friend. I grew up on a farm, and the creek we let our cattle drink from was often full of fish. While fishing, a neighbor of mine drove by and said hi. We had some normal fishing small talk, and he asked if we would like to try fishing his creek on his property. We hadn't had much luck, so my friend and I said we would give it a shot. We followed him to his creek, and he told us we could keep whatever we caught if we wanted. He also noticed that we had a rifle with us. We always had one in our truck in case we had predators around livestock and such. He mentioned he had some badgers digging holes around his stock, and if we saw one, he would be all right if we got rid of it so his cattle didn't injure a leg walking to the water. We packed up our stuff and walked down the short dirt road to the creek. The creek was to the east of us and ran in the north-south direction. On the south side of the road, there was a hill formed from dirt when the stock dam was dug out for his cattle, and the creek ran into the dam on the other side. We went to the mouth of the dam where the creek let in and fished for a while, noticing it was eerily quiet. Normally, there would be a lot of noise on a night like this. No wind in South Dakota means you'll be hearing all sorts of bugs, frogs, etc., but there was absolutely nothing. We thought that was strange, but kept fishing anyway. We were catching a lot of decent-sized fish. My friend was planning to stay at my house for a couple of days, so we decided we would keep a few to fry up the next day for lunch. To do this, we needed our net, and since it was such a short walk, we left our poles where they were. There was no fish big enough to pull them in, and walked back to the truck. On the way back, we heard some thrashing on the opposite side of the hill. This was odd because we were just on that side while fishing. When we reached the opposite end, we looked to see if a badger had been there, like my neighbor mentioned. There was nothing, but we could see where something had knocked down some cattails and other straw-type grass. What was weird was that way more seemed to be knocked down than what a badger could do, and none had been knocked down while we were on the other side just minutes earlier. Either way, we continued back to get our net. This time, on our way back, keep in mind the road from truck to fishing spot is probably 100 feet, if that. We heard what sounded like a huge bird flapping around in the same spot as the thrashing. The only large birds we have in that area are vultures, hawks, eagles, and owls. I've seen and heard all these birds up close before. This sounded much larger, and the flapping was way more sporadic and quick than any of these birds move their wings. It was very eerie, and we started to get a little scared. We decided to hustle back to where we were fishing to try and see what it was. When we got there, however, again there was nothing. We looked at each other and mentioned how weird it was and joked that it freaked us out a little. Then we noticed something had moved our fishing poles. The two poles had swapped places. At first I thought my head was playing tricks until we saw our lawn chairs. This confirmed something switched the poles because they were sitting near the foot of the opposite chairs now. This really started freaking us out, so we decided to start packing up and leave. As we were packing up, we started to hear a noise coming from the second dirt hill on the opposite side of the pond. There were cattails and reeds leading around the water to the other hill where the creek exited the stock dam. Now we could hear footsteps coming from the other side of the hill. We thought maybe it was my neighbor, but then we heard a combination of noises that scared the absolute hell out of us. We heard the thrashing from before coupled with the flapping and a new noise. This was like a growling, snarling noise, which made no sense. I have heard coyotes, foxes, badgers, possums, and all other manner of animal I grew up with, which growl or snarl at some point. This sounded like none, and the footsteps were large and heavy, like a bipedal animal, not a soft, swift one like a coyote. By now we were absolutely terrified. I grabbed the gun and we sprinted back to the truck. It was getting dark at this point. I told my friend to drive since I had the gun. We got in, he turned the headlights on, and we could see the splashing coming from the stock dam from where the truck was parked. We wanted to try and get a better look at what was splashing around, but were too scared. My friend backed us into the road and we sped home, with me clutching the gun the whole way. We never told anyone what happened, and I've only mentioned it to each other only once to this day. Next story. This happened in the autumn of 1993. It was probably around Labor Day because it was a 3-day weekend. I was about 11 years old. One of my uncles, whom worked off and on in construction, had just gotten a job as a caretaker for a piece of property in the Texas Hill Country. My uncle and his wife moved into an RV style trailer home in a 3 or 4 acre clearing of cedar and juniper about 30 or 40 feet behind a large 3.5 story Victorian style house on this property. The house was something like you would see on a plantation, definitely different than the ranch style or old German style homes you find in the area. It was old and dilapidated with a huge wraparound porch, peeling paint, and just a creepy vibe. You always felt like you were being watched. I didn't get to spend much time inside the house. We only briefly toured the bottom floor of the house when we arrived. My uncle said no one was allowed anywhere else since it was the owners believed animals were in residence and there was already extensive interior damage. The house was slated to be remodeled the following spring. The previous owners were obviously very wealthy and were in the cattle business or something like that. I really don't remember too much and haven't researched its history. My family had come up for a brief visit and to have a little barbecue and just get away for a while. Now, the trailer home itself was a kind of split level. At the front, there was a master bedroom, upstairs, a conjoined living room kitchen area extending to the back, and a small set of steps leading off the side down to a little bedroom that popped out from the side of the trailer home. This was my bedroom for the weekend. My parents slept in the master and my uncle and his wife on a pullout in the living room because they're hospitable like that. The first night, which was a Friday, my uncle mentioned in dinner conversation about how his wife, who was pregnant at the time, had been having strange feelings about being on the property. She just felt uneasy and couldn't seem to relax. My parents chalked this up to the difficulties of carrying twins. My uncle mentioned that they heard noises and saw lights coming from inside the big house one night. Discussion we had about the age of the property and possible hauntings or perhaps transients living on the property, but my uncle seemed adamant it was just animals and the nature of living on old rural property that has sat abandoned for a couple of decades. This particular uncle was a Vietnam veteran, and though prone to telling stories and jokes in gregarious fashion, he wasn't the type to just make things up out of the blue as he had seen some stuff, as they say. Usually the stories he told were pretty serious subject matter. We didn't really focus too much on all of this, but the house really did just loom over all of us and literally cast a shadow over the weekend's proceedings. Saturday afternoon we were played an impromptu baseball game on the front lawn of the house. After a while it was just my uncle and myself. We moved to the strip of lawn between the houses and the trailer and started playing catch and talking. We then heard a crashing noise coming from inside the house. Uncle looked to the right-hand side of the second floor and saw light coming from a window above the porch overhang. I saw his reaction and looked in the direction he did. There was a faint blue light coming from inside the house. It looked like it wasn't the room with the window, but shining in from the hall. It was faint but noticeable. About this time, my dad stepped out of the trailer to ask if we wanted to play cards. He stopped mid-sentence and said, "What is that?" As soon as he spoke, the light went out. My uncle and I turned and headed to the trailer. My dad and my uncle started discussing what the lights were. My dad thought it might be something electrical. They decided to go over and take a look. My aunt and I stood outside waiting for them. My aunt told me, "There's little gremlins in that house." I asked her what she meant, and she told me that there were these little gremlins that ran around on the property and they lived in the house. Matter of fact, just like that, she said that she woke up one night and saw one in the living room. It ran out of the door. She didn't tell my uncle because she thought he'd think she was crazy, but a few nights later, they were sitting in the living room one night and saw lights out of the window. She thought it was the gremlins working out there. This is what my uncle was talking about on the first night, about her feeling uneasy. After a few minutes, my dad and my uncle returned and they said they didn't see anything. My uncle didn't mention anything about gremlins. I asked him if the lights they talked about that night before, and he said, "I told you there's something in that house." He said it's kind of jokingly, though. In hindsight, I think he was just trying not to scare anyone or seem weird. Maybe he was trying to pull a prank or something. But he's not the type, and he wouldn't be so elaborate. At this point, I didn't know what to think. I was thinking more about the little gremlins from the old Bugs Bunny cartoon. The final night, which was Sunday, was when things got weird, at least for me. Sunday, we had the barbecue. The day was fairly uneventful. That night, I was just beginning to fall asleep. I heard and felt three hard knocks on the side of the trailer. Thump, thump, thump. It was hard enough to wake me up, and I'm a bit of a heavy sleeper. At first, I thought someone had fallen down the stairs. I got up and looked around the corner, up the short staircase to the living room. The lights were off, and my uncle and his wife appeared to be asleep on the sofa. I lay back down and tried to put it out of my mind. I was in bed maybe 15 minutes when I heard a sound outside my window, right by my head. I'm fairly certain I hadn't fallen asleep yet. I turned to look, and I was staring face to face with a great type of alien being with only a pane of glass between us. He had his head turned and was looking down and to his right at something on the ground. I was frozen solid in fear. As soon as I sensed that he was going to turn and see me, I turned my whole body away and covered my head. I lay there trying to catch and hold my breath at the same time, hoping that I was dreaming. After a minute or two, I worked up the courage to turn back around to the window. The entity was no longer by my window, but I saw it moving around by the tree line a few yards from the trailer. It was about 3 or 4 feet tall and looked the same as the creature that I believe I saw once as a child before, only a little taller. This time the uniform it was wearing was a silver color that absorbed an amplified shadow. Hard to describe, but the dark bits of where shadow fell on the suit became blacker than black. This effect kind of broke up the body when viewed. I was sitting there thinking about this and staring at this creature. He didn't seem to notice me or really care. There was no interaction between us. I didn't have the courage to say hello or anything. I guess I was just genuinely freaked out and trying to figure out if I was dreaming or not. I was thinking about these things maybe for about 5 minutes. Just then, two blue orbs of light appeared in the tree about 2 feet off the ground on either side of the entity. They were about the size of a large beach ball and about as bright as a camp lantern. The one on the left began to move to the center towards the entity, and the one on the right began moving forward out of the trees. As soon as it got past the tree line and onto the open yard, the light from it got a bit brighter. I could see the outline of the entity and the shape of its head. The skin was a dull gray pink, tinged by blue by the orb's light. The entity turned around and faced the orbs and then turned back. As soon as it turned back, it began to emit a glow of blue light. It appeared like a radioactive kind of halo emanating from inside its body, like a bioluminescence. It wrapped around its whole body and then completely engulfed the being in bright light. This happened in the course of maybe 2 seconds. The flash of light was so bright it lit up the whole yard and trailer like it was daytime. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them, the entity was gone, and in its place was a perfectly round orb of blue light. Now, this here's how I know it wasn't a dream. A few seconds after this flash of light, I heard my uncle's wife get up in the living room. She called my uncle's name. I heard her tell him to get up and look out the window. As soon as I heard her tell him to look out the side, I sprung up from my bed and ran into the living room. I told him that I could see the lights outside and told my aunt that I saw the gremlins outside and that they were inside the balls of light. My uncle said that he knew it, that they were in the house. We looked out the window and the three orbs of light were still there. I went to knock on my parents' door and told them to look out the window at the lights. I got back and I stood with my aunt and uncle at the window. We watched as the lights on the left zoomed off and then back to the rear end of the trailer. The one on the right, which was now in the center, and the one that was the entity moved back towards the tree line. I ran to the other side of the living room to see if I could see the other light. My aunt called me back to the window and said to see it hover over on her side again. I ran back to join them and looked. I saw it from our right side. It had made a loop around the trailer. As soon as it got back to the other two orbs, they all began to rise up 6 feet into the air. They all combined together in the center and shot off, straight into the sky. Once again, the light was so bright it lit up the whole area. My mom and dad came out of the bedroom and down the stairs, and my mom said, "What was that?" This part in the living room was maybe 45 seconds to a minute from the time I came into the living room and to the time the lights all took off. I told my mom and dad what I saw and that I thought I was dreaming, but my aunt and my uncle saw the lights. My parents said they didn't see any creatures or the orbs themselves. They were trying to figure out what I was saying when they heard me running in the house and knew everyone else was awake. They were getting clothes on to come outside and saw the bright flash at the window as the orbs were leaving. We all sat around for the next hour or so as we talked about what we saw. My parents were pretty skeptical, but I guess they didn't know what to think. They just thought it was weird. They said they thought maybe it was a kid or a car pulling into the property or something. They didn't really believe me about the alien, and I didn't tell them about my last experience either. I don't know why. We all went back to sleep after a while, but I slept in the living room. My uncle and aunt ended up moving out of there the next year when the owner and his new crew came in. I think they ended up tearing down the old house. From what I recall, my uncle told my dad it was too damaged inside and the guy didn't want to pay for it. Shame, it was a nice house. My family doesn't really talk about this unless I bring it up. But really, I don't think they have any worthwhile opinion on the matter. The one thing that has affected me the most about this encounter was how scared I was. It caused me to have trouble sleeping for quite a while after that. I would sleep with a pillow over my head, and I wouldn't sleep near a window that didn't have a cover over it. Next story. In 1999, I was working at a state park in Pennsylvania. Got to know the back areas of it pretty well. The areas most tourists do not get to see. Approximately 1 mile from the park on a long alder road was a large clearing in the woods which was cleared for power lines and gas well use. Once you got to that spot, you would have to walk over a long hill until you came to an old abandoned trail. If you followed this trail, it would take you deep into the forest. One day I followed it and found that it led to an old dilapidated cabin, and it looked like it hadn't been used for many decades. Even though it was daylight, I still got this creepy feeling like I shouldn't be there, and worse, that something was watching every move I made. A few weeks later, while I was off duty, two of my friends and myself were just out driving around enjoying the summer night, and since I knew all the back roads, I was taking them on a kind of a tour. No, none of these roads are off limits or secret, so I wasn't breaking any rules. Other than that mysterious cabin, the park didn't have any secrets. About 11 p.m. I came to that familiar clearing and I mentioned something about the old cabin. Being a brave soul, I talked them into letting me show them the cabin. So I grabbed my flashlight and we took off down the hill and onto the path that led to the cabin. I took the lead and we walked halfway when all of a sudden my light flashed on something on the right side of the path. Almost immediately I stopped and said, "Did you just see that?" To which they responded, "See what?" As I panned the light back to the right side of the road, I said, "That." There, standing by a tree, was a creature only seen in sci-fi movies. It had a grayish olive skin color and very thin in its extremities. The calves and forearm muscles were very large as well as was the chest. The face was the strangest thing since it had the typical alien gray head shape, but there was no mouth. It had a nose that was long and thin, but not longer than its chin. The eyes had a reddish gleam in the light, but not the size of most reported aliens. Very small, even by human standards. I hate to make this reference for fear of questioning my sanity, but my best description was like what the goons looked like in the Popeye cartoon. It leaned oddly against a tree, like if you were leaning on an armchair by only one arm. To make another TV show reference, but like the Fonz would lean on the jukebox on Happy Days, minus the legs being crossed. Immediately, everyone wanted to leave, but as we turned, my flashlight went out. My friends told me to quit messing around with them and turn the light back on, to which I informed them that I wasn't messing with them and to keep moving now that I was at the back of the group. I frantically continued to beat on my flashlight, trying to get it to work again. As soon as it came back on, I immediately swiveled back around to shine it behind us. The creature had moved up significantly and now was on the left side. We hurried to the clearing, and once we got back up the hill and to the main dirt road, things got worse. Out of the woods we had just come through was this high-pitched, blood-curdling screeching noise which, after it started, others started to answer back from the other side of the clearing. The fact that I was a park ranger, had been in the woods all my life, and had my degree from Penn State in wildlife management means I've heard a lot of noise in the wild, but I had never heard that sound before. I knew it wasn't any kind of owl or bobcat, bird, bear, porcupine. You get the drift. Once I told my dad about the encounter, he told me it could have been the chupacabras, which I'd never heard of before, and as far as aliens go, never believed in it until recently. Months went by without incident, other than not being able to shake that "I'm watching you" feeling. I was to the point of feeling like I was being stalked. One night, I went to get something from my truck when I looked into the woods and saw those reddish glowing eyes staring at me in the shadows. I immediately ran into the house and grabbed my biggest knife. I'm not a gun guy, to which my dad asked me what I was doing. I told him I was tired of feeling stalked and was going to face this thing. He told me he was coming with me, but all along I knew he never truly believed me or my encounter. When we got outside, he nonchalantly asked, "Okay, where did you see this thing?" And I pointed to the spot, to which he directed his flashlight. Much to his disbelief, there it was, and as soon as the light hit it, it tore off deep into the woods. My dad, an ex-Marine who served proudly during Vietnam, yelled at me to get back into the house with fear in his voice. To this day, it still creeps me out, talking about this encounter, and my hands shake even while I start to recall it. I'm now in my 30s with a wife and kids, but even now, when I go outside at night, I still feel watched to the point that when I get a real strong feeling, my wife won't let me leave the house without her. Just as a side note, for the first 5 years of our relationship, she too would catch sight of this creature, but mostly as it was going into the shadows. As a further note, if anyone is questioning it, there were no drugs or alcohol or any other substance involved during this or any encounter I've ever had. Next story. Falling between the final years of the 1960s, the United States became embroiled in the conflict with the intention of aiding South Vietnam and, of course, to bolster the ongoing effort toward the spread of democracy in parts of the world still riddled by communism. So far as historic periods of conflict are concerned, Vietnam is indeed remembered as one of the darker periods in history, and within its shadow of obscurity, there are nonetheless a number of curious accounts and seldom spoken mysteries which have prevailed over the years, begging questions as to what kind of odd operations might have been taking place behind the scenes, so to speak. That is, of course, if such strange stories can be believed. Indeed, some of the more bizarre accounts from the Vietnam years are so strange they might likely fall beyond the jurisdiction of what can even be considered believable. And yet the story persists, which include accounts of friendly giants, glowing non-humans, and winged wonder women drifting about the deep jungles by cover of night. The stories of strange humanoid beings appearing under the Vietnam conflict are many and varied, with one of the most memorable accounts stemming from the summer of 1969 near the Da Nang province, where Earl Morrison and his company witnessed something truly out of the ordinary. He and his two companions had been stationed during a watch above a bunker near the city of Da Nang when the three of them began to notice a strange figure moving toward them from overhead in the distance. Quote, "It looked like a woman, a naked woman. She was black. Her skin was black. Her body was black. The wings were black. Everything was black. But it glowed. It glowed in the night, kind of greenish cast to it. There was a glow on her and around her. Everything glowed. Looked like she glowed and threw off a radiance. We saw her arms toward the wings, and they looked like regular molded arms, each with a hand and fingers and everything, but they had skin from the wings going over them. And when she flapped her wings, there was no noise at first. It looked like her arms didn't have any bones in them, and because they were limber, just like a bat. She started going over us, and we still didn't hear anything. She was right above us, and when she got over the top of our heads, she was maybe 6 or 7 feet up. We couldn't do anything. We didn't know what to do. We just froze. We just watched what was going on because we couldn't believe our eyes. So we watched her go straight over the top of us, and still she didn't make any noise, flapping her wings. She blotted out the moon once, that's how close she was to us. As we watched her, she got about 10 feet or so away from us. We started hearing her wings flap, and it sounded, like regular wings flapping. And she just started flying off, and we watched her for quite a while. The total time when we first saw her and could almost define her until we lost sight of her and weren't able to define her was between 3 or 4 minutes. End quote. 40 researcher John Keel featured the strange story in his book The Mothman Prophecies, as it obviously appeared in detail the presence of a large winged humanoid, similar to later reports of a creature allegedly seen around Point Pleasant, West Virginia, around the same time. There were, however, other reports of so-called mystery beings seen during the Vietnam years. In his book UFOs in Wartime, author Mac Maloney recounts a curious story where one soldier claimed he was saved by a giant that appeared and attacked an approaching enemy. As this rather odd and whimsical story goes, the witness claimed to have been assisting a landed helicopter, which subsequently took off after being repaired, leaving the witness slightly disoriented and eventually lost in the jungle. Soon afterward, he would claim that he heard the voices of oncoming Vietnamese soldiers, and just as one had attempted to confront him, he heard a loud crack, followed by the appearance of the dead enemy soldier in front of him. There, behind the dead would-be assassin, stood an 8-foot tall giant dressed perfectly and clad in an odd-looking helmet who told him to return to his helicopter. Not all reports of encounters with beings during the Vietnam years were quite so benevolent. However, one story, shared in Martin S. Caden's book Natural or Supernatural, detailed a peculiar story the author claimed to have collected from one GI, who along with his company made the claim of having met a group of terrifying glowing yellow humanoids that were impervious to gunfire. The story had been related to Caden by a U.S. Marine calling himself David E. Gower, having allegedly transpired on December 17, 1974 while serving the 5th Special Forces Group, Marine Detachment. It had been an ambush, and Gower and his team had been carried upriver by boat and deployed carrying Browning automatic rifles, a 45 caliber Thompson subgun, 4 M16 rifles, and an M79 grenade launcher. As Gower and his company traveled along, they reached a clearing where they found that none of the usual outdoor sounds, not even the familiar sound of insects common to the humid jungle landscape. At this time, one of the soldiers became aware of a large deposit of strange-looking fecal matter. Shortly thereafter, the soldiers claimed to see at least 3 large yellow ape-like beings emerge from the nearby forest. These creatures were between 7 and 8 feet in height, yellow in color and glowing. At first, Gower and his company remained concealed, but after initiating a retreat, they were pursued by these beasts, which Gower claimed were essentially impervious to the heavy fire of the weaponry. Miraculously, Gower and his company said they made it back to their boats and claimed that the entire way back down the river they were able to see the bright glowing in the distance along the shoreline, presumably emanating off the bodies of these terrifying creatures. Can such strange claims of encounters with mystery humanoids be taken as anything more than mere myth and fantasy? While the claims of soldiers during times of conflict may lend themselves to a bit less scrutiny than those of the average witness, many of these stories are simply so bizarre that to take them literally might force one to change his or her entire concept of what constitutes reality. So what can be made of tales like these? Are they perhaps the best evidence for mystery humanoids in our midst, by virtue of having been reported by various officers during the Vietnam conflict? Or are they simply proof that a teller of tall tales will go to great lengths to fabricate a good story, and despite the professional disposition, indeed as we see here, begins to become hard to tell at times?